Look! The platform we almost never cover on this channel. Hey now, it's not my fault. I was never supposed to be the one covering PlayStation stuff, and honestly, it's still not really my main jam. I'm a PC gamer through and through. But I'm also a huge fan of a good single-player third-person open-world RPG, stuff like The Witcher, Divinity, Fallout, Baldur's Gate, and even their ARGB counterparts like Diablo. It's the character customization and world design that really sucks me into these games, but if there's a solid story as well, it definitely doesn't hurt. And while I'm totally happy to take a chance on a game I've never even heard anything about based solely on it being a part of this genre, typically a single RPG isn't going to sell me an entirely new computer or anything like that. So, all that being said, let's take a minute to discuss the game that sold me a PS4 single-handedly, and why I'm not even mad about it. Based on early context clues, you may have guessed that Horizon Zero Dawn is a single-player, third-person open-world RPG, sort of like The Witcher, Divinity, Fallout, etc. This is probably a little anticlimactic at this point in the review, but based on these same context clues, you may have guessed that I think it's good. But in case that wasn't clear, let me express it directly. It's good. It's honestly straight up one of the best RPGs I've ever played, and while yeah, I bought both my copy of the game and the PS4 Pro I played it on used, I still paid over $200 on it, and like I said, I'm not even mad. This game is actually worth both the investment of money and the investment of time, and much like The Witcher 3 before it, I'm genuinely bummed that I didn't make that investment sooner. Though, I mean, not all that bummed, considering investing sooner would have resulted in the expenditure of way more money for basically a single game. Though, that's not fair, I suppose. I bought and played Journey on this thing too, and I actually have a copy of God of War that I need to get around to playing one of these years. Y'all weren't on a time crunch for any of these reviews, were you? Of course not. Who's ever looking for timely game reviews? That's just silly. Well, at least I'm getting it out around the right time for all you PC players. So, Horizon. Or do we just call it Zero Dawn? I spent quite a while treating the whole thing like it was just one long, incredibly incomprehensible statement, but with the announcement of the sequel, I think that Zero Dawn is technically a subtitle. So in order to distinguish this Horizon game from the next Horizon game, shall we just call it Zero Dawn? And the next one can go by Forbidden West, and the franchise is just Horizon. Glad we took the time out of this review to straighten out the semantics of the game's title. So, Herpity Derp Zoomy Dune managed to work its way into the upper crusties of RPGs I hardly recommend to people who don't play RPGs, or heck, games of any kind. I think it's fair to say that it did that without doing anything particularly novel with its gameplay. In terms of gameplay, what you're watching here is about 40% Lara Croft crossed with maybe 35% Geralt of Rivia, while the remaining 25% is cribbed from a half dozen other sources like Fallout, Hitman, and Red Dead Redemption. In short, there's not really anything in here that strikes me as completely original in terms of gameplay, but the gameplay that's in here is at least done very well regardless. In Zero Dawn, you're going to spend a lot of time riding around on the back of some animal because your fast travel system requires perishables. You'll scramble around like an addict picking up every plant that has an icon hovering over it because you need to craft arrows and suck on weeds for the magic healing juices that'll set your broken leg instantly or whatever. You'll sit on a ledge using your magic see-through walls vision to carefully monitor the incredibly regular patrol routes of your adversaries before dropping into a patch of one specific type of weed to try and get close enough to assassinate a few of them without being seen. And when you inevitably get spotted during the assassinate animation, you'll jump and run around the area shooting and flailing wildly, tanking way more hits than the average M4 Sherman. Then after you've killed all your enemies, and despite the fact that you left literally no witnesses, all of the other faceless bad guys in the world will somehow come to recognize you by force of reputation. You'll gain experience from your massacres, then use that experience to build up a skill tree that lets you slow down time to aim, shoot multiple arrows at once, and so on. There's nothing really new in any of that. You can throw stuff to distract people, you can whistle to attract stuff to a hiding place, you have a few different types of ammunition that you can craft in the middle of a pitched battle by closing your eyes and wishing real hard until a half dozen arrows squeeze out of your ears. You'll loot a ton of crafting resources off the corpses of your victims, you'll trade with merchants in towns for the stuff that you can't craft, and you'll spend an embarrassing amount of time looking at the overworld map checking off a list of menial tasks and unrelated activities that probably would make the characters involved with the main questline a little worried about whether you're actually going to get around to saving the world before it's too late if they ever stop talking about themselves long enough to let you talk about you. Does any of this sound familiar? Because if you've played any of the games I mentioned earlier, this should all sound pretty familiar. Zero Dawn isn't a carbon copy of any one particular game, but it does siphon its gameplay out of a pretty short list, and even for chronic underplayers such as myself, it'll likely feel pretty familiar. Now, I'm about to make a point that'll probably trigger some folks, so here's your trigger warning. The gameplay is nothing new, yes, and it felt pretty rote to me. I was fully settled into the controls with entirely set gameplay expectations after about an hour of playing is all. I didn't bother doing any of the skippable tutorial missions because I simply didn't need the tutorial. But far from making the game boring or trite, it actually makes it better. That's right. Copying gameplay from a half dozen other popular sources was the right call. Failing to come up with anything novel in terms of gameplay was a good move. Well done, Guerrilla Games. You can feel free to start fighting in the comments if you'd like, but maybe finish watching the video first so you at least know what my justification for that is. Because, as I said, while there's nothing new, the gameplay tropes I've just listed are implemented well. If you're new to all these tropes, then Zero Dawn will give you a solid experience with all of them, and the tutorials are very helpful. If you're familiar with this stuff, many of the tutorials are thankfully skippable. But the main thing is that the gameplay doesn't frustrate, though I guess if one of those tropes frustrates you, your mileage may vary. What the gameplay does, by virtue of being so familiar, is get the heck out of my way and just let me play the game. And that's a massive win when the game you're playing has one of the most unique settings in video game history. The world of Zero Dawn is the real winner here. The way it's designed is amazing, with just about every square meter of space feeling like it was handcrafted by a graphic artist, and the traversal game mechanics they stole from Tomb Raider really helped show it off. The robot dinosaur things don't really behave any differently than the larger trophy wildlife in Red Dead Redemption, but they're freaking robot dinosaur things. The creature and sound design for the things is completely on point, and I pretty much guarantee you've never seen anything like these before. There's also a ton of variety throughout the game world, which, while some folks may just classify it as the Western United States, I can confirm it is literally set basically entirely in Utah, with maybe some bits in northern Arizona. I'm still a little baffled that Delicate Arch managed to survive the apocalypse. And, oh yeah, it's a post-apocalypse game with an actual color palette instead of a narrow gradient of beige. The people in the game belong to these fascinating cultures that seem mostly invented, though it may be that I'm just an uneducated schmuck. But the places these cultures have built in the world, the way they dress, the way they talk, all of it is very well established, very effectively delineated, and shockingly consistent even among the non-interactive NPCs scattered around. Everything about this world is stunningly original, and honestly having new and challenging gameplay would have distracted me from that. I suspect that on balance, the game would have been worse as a result. The story is also very well done, if not quite as standout as the setting. Speaking as a fan of science fiction when it's done well, the premise for Zero Dawn is genuinely fascinating. The characters in the story are, for the most part, competently written and excellently performed. Considering this is an open-world RPG, you do run into that signature weirdness where even the main story characters will occasionally send you on silly fetch quests to pad out the game time. But Zero Dawn isn't as egregious as some games, though it doesn't quite manage to reach the level of The Witcher 3, where even the pointless side quests felt like they had actual stakes. By and large, I love the story, and while I was a little peeved at times that in order to get the entire story you had to pick up and read a short book's worth of written datapad entries, it drew me in and held my interest throughout. And heck, it managed to give our main character Aloy a fairly well-structured little character arc with naturally evolving emotional responses, while still managing to make her even more badass than Lara Croft at her best. There's plenty of little flaws, but no major oversights in either the world or the story. And again, the gameplay gets out of the way and just lets the immersion take over. If you ramp up the difficulty, the game does get harder, yes, but at least to my eye, that doesn't actually make the game any more fun. It actually makes it worse. My recommendation would be to find a game difficulty that mildly challenges you, and don't be worried about adjusting that down if the game starts getting frustrating later on. Because the real reward of Zero Dawn for me was not that I completed it, it was that I got to spend 70 hours exploring that world. I've still got the expansion to go, actually, though maybe I'll just pick that up on PC, so I can spend another 70 hours exploring that world with consistent frame rates and halfway reasonable loading times. That's a commentary on the PS4, not the game. Just so we're totally clear.